Hello? Hello? Can you hear me all up there at the back? Anyone who can't hear me, wave their arm. Okay, you can hear me. So, thank you all for coming this evening, which is a little bit of a special evening. I'm I run the Cambridge University Strategic Analysis Group, and it was a very hot summer's day about 2 months ago when someone said, what we really, really ought to do is invite to Cambridge Yanis, because of everything that's been happening over the summer. And we looked at each other when we had that idea, and we said, controversial decision, let's sort of test it on people. And so we sent out various emails to, senior economists, senior people, and never, never, never have we had such an extreme spectrum of responses. Never in the history of our society. So on the one hand, we had people saying, are you crazy? Are you mad? This man knows nothing, he's totally incompetent, you're absolutely out of your minds, inviting him. On the other extreme, we had people saying, an economic genius, the only person to really understand what's going wrong with Europe. And we had every shade of opinion in between. We even had one, I remember, which I think goes off the end of the spectrum in a rather English way, which said, he's got some interesting ideas. Well, the point of tonight is for you to make up your mind on that issue. This man has been vilified by most of the presses in his country and abroad. A few have said he was David against Goliath, and certainly the Greek position was David against Goliath. And the events over the summer gripped us all because in one sense we could see the end game, but we could also see the maneuvering that was taking place. Lots of strange things happened which were not fully explained and not totally logical. And my own college is Amartya Sen, I'm from Trinity College. My own college is Amartya Sen said, this is probably the first time in history that a lender has lent money to a borrower with conditions attached, which will make it impossible for the borrower to pay back the loan. And indeed, a few days later, the IMF issued a report saying exactly the same thing. And one of the very interesting questions is, why was the IMF report delayed until a few days after the negotiation finished? There were lots of strange things that happened which were not fully understood, and the mass media explanation of it doesn't quite hang up. And therefore, to give us an inside view of what was really going on, and to explain that he's not quite the rabid Marxist that he's been painted to, is the purpose of tonight. And so we decided to go with it and to invite Yanis. And I think it wasn't the wrong decision, because when the tickets went on sale for the Marshall Society, they were all sold out within 30 seconds. He spoke in London 3 days ago, and we have never ever had such positive feedback from a speaker. And he was at the wrong place, the other place, on Saturday. So let's beat that. And we're doing this, we decided the issue was so important that we would not hog it and keep it all to ourselves, and we would share it with the Union Society, for which I have huge respect, and also with the Marshall Society. And so this is a collaboration so that as many people as possible can get to hear the other side of the story, Yanis' side of the story. And so with that, let me hand over to the presidents of the Marshall and Union Society to say a few words, and then to Yanis.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We'll be very brief because you're not here to see us and you have no interest in what we're going to say. But the Union is incredibly proud and excited to be working with the Marshall Society and Steve Strategic and EHAB for putting together this event. And I'm sorry you've all had to queue for so long. Unfortunately, it is a very popular event. And as a result, we had to get a lot of you in at once, and I'm sorry for that. But we hope you enjoy the event, and thank you to the Marshall Society for assisting us.
And we'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our collaborators, including the Cambridge Union, for supplying us with this beautiful, beautiful building to accommodate all of you wonderful visitors. And we hope that this is the beginning of a very long and lasting collaboration between our two societies and Cambridge.
No, we really do. Looks like we're dating. So without further ado, I hope you will join me in welcoming our speaker for tonight, Yanis Varoufakis.
Dear IHUB, members of the collaborating societies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, it's been 27 years since I've given any form of talk in this place. I remember the day I left Trinity back in 1988 to take up a position in Australia at the University of Sydney. The master of the college asked me, "Why? Do you despise civilization, my dear boy?" He was the same man who had welcomed me with the words, the kind words, "How does it feel to be inducted in polite society?" Cambridge is a wonderful place. And now I have to convince you of how chuffed I am. It is true I'm chuffed, but I have to convince you against the devastating information that they have imparted against my wishes, that my last appearance was at the wrong place. Let me begin by saying that in this presentation, I'm going to resist giving you all the details about negotiations, about shenanigans in Brussels, about discussions with Dr. Schäuble and so on, and leave this for later because I'm sure that your questions are going to bring this up. So allow me to do something different today in this talk. What I want to do is I want to make a plea to all of you, especially students, to take very seriously the crucial significance of the Cambridge tradition in the world of political economics. Because the only thing that I brought to politics in the last year of some substance is whatever this Cambridge tradition endowed me with. It sounds as if I'm sucking up, but it is true. Let me take you to a moment, sometime in January of 2010. The Greek state had gone bankrupt. The Greek prime minister didn't know it. It took some months before he realized it. I had been a previous advisor to that gentleman, and I made a name for myself. That was not my intention, by declaring that the Greek state was bankrupt. And I did so quoting a certain man that you all have heard of, John Maynard Keynes, and in particular, I used a quotation from The Economic Consequences of the Peace. What I did was actually to replace, mischievously, some of his words. This is what I put in my article. It was the end of my article. By the way, the title of the article was Greek Insolvency, Why It Is Important to Resist a New Versailles Treaty. And I used this quotation. Moved by insane delusion and reckless self-regard, Greece overturned the foundations on which Europe lived and built. That is, acknowledging the fact that Greece had accumulated debt that it was impossible to repay. But the spokesmen of the European Union have run the risk of completing the ruin which Greece began by a bailout agreement which, if it sees the light of day, if it is carried into effect, must impair yet further when it might have restored the delicate, complicated organization already shaken and broken by the 2008 crisis, through which alone the people of Europe can employ themselves and live. This is an extract from Keynes's Economic Consequences of the Peace. All I changed, instead of Germany, I used the word Greece. Instead of the allies, which Keynes had used, I mentioned the European authorities. Instead of the Great War, in Keynes's original, I referred to the 2008 credit crunch. What I was trying to do with that argument, with that article and the quotation, and the dramatic utilization of Keynes's argumentation, was to warn that the mighty in Europe, the powerful European powers, were about to commit a major grave error. Now, usually, victors write the terms and conditions of the peace, and they do impose the iron will upon the defeated. But what the Versailles Treaty that Keynes was lambasting did was something unique in history. The Allies, the victors, were imposing upon the defeated terms and conditions that ended up being detrimental to the victors. That had never happened before, and that was the genius of Keynes's economic consequence of the peace, to warn Britain and France that by imposing these strict measures and reparations upon defeated Germany, they would creating a process that would eventually result in circumstances that would be detrimental to Britain and France. And that was my great worry. My nation, because the state had gone bankrupt, was about to be subjected to a new Versailles Treaty that would impose upon Greece conditions of austerity that not only would deplete the national income of Greece, but would set off a sequence of events that eventually would sting the rest of Europe with catastrophic results on the European Union, on economic prospects of the continent, and particularly on European democracy. Now, some weeks ago, I was just reminded when I was coming in here, I had come to Cambridge to be part of BBC Question Time on television. And at some point, and I think that had some effect on the audience, there was a member of the audience who, in typical fashion, put forward the basic argument in favor of austerity during periods of increased government deficit. And the argument was that if he has a tenner in his pocket and he tries to drink 5 or 6 pints of beer, the only way he can do this is by borrowing, and if he keeps doing this day after day, then things will be terrible for him. He's going to go bankrupt, and the only solution is belt tightening, is to become austere. And therefore, if this is true for me, he said, isn't this true for Britain? So why are you against austerity? And I had to put him right in a way that effectively reflects the Cambridge tradition. The distinction between the micro and the macro that Keynes made so famous. The idea, of course, being that unlike your private life, where you are blessed by an independence between your income and your expenditure, if you spend less on pints of beer, you have more saved. In the case of a macroeconomy, total expenditure is total income. So when a crisis begins, the private sector deleverages, starts spending less. If the state responds to the increase in its deficit caused by the fact that the reduction in private expenditure translates into a reduction in the tax take, and at the same time the unemployment which is rising translates into heavier expenditure on things like unemployment benefits, if the government panics and starts cutting, at that time goes austere, transfers the strategy of belt tightening from the individual level, from the micro level to the level of the government, what will happen is public expenditure is going to go down at a time when private expenditure is going to go down. What is the sum of private and public expenditure? It's national income. Do you really want to speed up the diminution of national income during a crisis? That was the fallacy of composition that comes effectively from this place, from Cambridge. The troika of lenders, in the case of Greece, in the case of Spain, in the case of Ireland, Portugal, and so on and so forth, have taken the logic of the man in the audience during that BBC Question Time program and have elevated to the plane of Tina, that there is no alternative to this particular policy for Europe. We have created in Europe, in continental Europe, a monetary union which is based on this logic. The logic being that when a particular economy, like the Greek economy or the Irish economy or the Portuguese economy, finds itself in a situation where debts and losses are accumulating and the deficits of the government are increasing, that what it should do is should follow this particular belt-tightening logic, austerity, in order to reduce deficits. And the argument that has been prevailing now for 15, 20 years in Europe is that since you don't have your own currency to devalue, because if you did, and you lost competitiveness, and you had debts, what would happen is the rest of the world would punish you, in inverted commas, by selling off your currency would come down, that would restore your competitiveness because your exports would become cheaper internationally, and your imports would become dearer domestically. But if you don't have that, what do you do? The answer is, the Australian answer is, what you do is you go for internal devaluation. You push wages down, you push prices down, and that way your exports become competitive, more competitive, they restore equilibrium in exactly the same way as in a nation like Britain, which has its own currency, whose currency would simply decline. That is a fallacy which one would understand as a fallacy had one been schooled in the traditions of Cambridge economics. Unfortunately, that tradition has been depleted, I'm afraid also in Cambridge, if I'm not incorrect, by reading the literature that is coming out of this university over the last 20 years. Sometimes it pays to be an outsider in order to comment on the goings-on inside. The basic problem with this logic is this. Actually, it's twofold. Firstly, let's say that indeed prices and wages fall in a country which is in crisis like Greece or in Ireland, and the prices and wages did fall. In my country, wages fell by 40%. Prices by a lot less, but they fell. There's one thing that doesn't fall, you know, during such internal devaluation: debt. Debt doesn't fall. Debt rises because the interest rate is positive, the nominal interest rate, so it rises. So even if everybody accepts lower prices and lower wages, that simply means that those who are insolvent within the country, individuals, companies, and the state itself, become even more so insolvent, because nothing deepens insolvency more than a diminution in national income, while at the same time debt goes up. Cambridge has produced thinkers whose work would have warned very efficiently against this folly. Let me read out something that was written by a man called Nicholas Calder in 1970 in the New Statesman. It is a dangerous error to believe that monetary and economic union can precede a political union, or that it will act, in the words of the Werner report, that was a report that came out of Brussels in 1970, as a leaven for the evolution, he means, of a political union, which in the long run it will in any case be unable to do without. What Calder effectively said in 1970, think about it, decades before Europe's monetary union. What he did was to warn Europeans, if you think you're going to create a monetary union, and that will be a stepping stone towards a political union, you have another thing coming. The idea that we bind our currencies together to produce a monetary union, on top of which we would later erect a political union, that was the ideology behind the Eurozone project. Let me take you to 1993 now for a moment. In 1993, there was a very interesting meeting that happened in some neon-lit office in Brussels. There were 3 men in that room. There was President Mitterrand of France, President Jacques Delors, President of the European Commission, who was the major force, intellectual force, and administrative force behind the creation of the Eurozone, and a very good friend and colleague of mine who used to be, actually in the 1980s, a member of parliament in the House of Commons, Stuart Holland. Stuart had convinced Jacques Delors that the European monetary union project, which was beginning then, would be wholly unstable for good reasons that Nicolas Kaldor had warned, had we not created in parallel to the monetary union a means by which to recycle surpluses from the surplus regions of Europe to the deficit regions of Europe, not as handouts, but as investment into productive activities and productive capacity in the deficit regions, investment that would produce the incomes that would be necessary to keep purchasing the exports, the net exports of the surplus part of the monetary union. Jacques Delors, who was a very smart man, despite my great differences of opinion with him on a very large number of issues, understood the importance of that. And that together they wrote a green paper on the importance of creating an investment arm or pillar that would supplement the monetary pillar. You create the monetary union, and then you have a pillar of investment that takes savings, excess savings from the surplus countries like Germany, which is always replete with savings. Why? Because it has net exports. Net exports of a country translate into idle savings. Take those savings and invest them in the deficit areas in order to balance out the monetary union. Imagine this scene. Jacques Delors, who used to be President Mitterrand's finance minister, is trying to convince Mitterrand that this is the way to stabilize the Eurozone before the Eurozone was created, right at its birth. He spoke, I've been told by Stuart, for 40 minutes, and then stopped. And the great French president started looking at the ceiling, and he pinned his eyes upon the ceiling for 10 whole minutes. Believe me, it's very disconcerting to have the French president looking at the ceiling for 10 minutes while you're waiting for his verdict. And then he turned around and he said, Jacques, you're quite right. This monetary union that we're creating needs this. But we're not going to do it. And we're not going to do it because neither I nor Helmut, he meant Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, have the political clout to do it at this stage. But then he added, but when an international, a global financial crisis hits the Eurozone, our monetary union, in 10 years' time or so, then our successors will have a choice, a stark choice, either to do this, what you are suggesting, or to let the whole thing shrivel and die. Quite astute. It didn't take 10 years, it took longer, for 2008, our generation's 1929 to come. Alas, Mitterrand was wrong. Just like Margaret Thatcher was wrong, when in 1990 she had said that European Monetary Union is federation through the back door. Where is the federation? Have you seen it? I haven't. Mitterrand was wrong too, in the same way as Margaret Thatcher. This crisis has not given rise to a process of creating the institutions which are necessary to stabilize our monetary union. Instead, we have continuous fragmentation, and we have continuous depression in parts of the union, deflation in other parts, and only in some parts a smidgen of recovery which is based on bubble creation, which is not the kind of recovery you want. In 1925, John Maynard Keynes wrote his second economic consequences of something. The first was the economic consequences of the peace in 1919. The second was the economic consequences of Mr. Churchill. It was a very well-written pamphlet by which Keynes lambasted Churchill, who was then Chancellor in this country, for having returned Britain to the Eurozone of that time, to the gold standard, to the fixed exchange rate regime, which is more or less a common currency. And what was the criticism of John Maynard Keynes? The criticism effectively was that if you bind together deficit and surplus countries without the mechanisms that people like Jacques Delors and Stuart Holland were recommending to Mitterrand, mechanisms for recycling surpluses from the surplus regions to the deficit regions. If you do that, you are asking for major trouble. Why? Well, think about it. Take a country like Germany and a country like Greece. I'm choosing them completely at random. Now, Germany is always going to have a surplus vis-à-vis Greece. Always did, always will. Just like London is, the greater London economy is always going to have a surplus in relation to Yorkshire. Or, well, actually, that wasn't the case at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but at least it has been the case for the last 150 years, right? And it will be the case next year, in 10 years' time, in 50 years' time. So every economy contains deficit and surplus parts, even Germany itself. Eastern Germany, parts of northern, western Germany, in relation to other parts of Germany, have this relationship between surplus and deficit regions. Now, if these different countries or economies have their separate currencies, the deficit country's currency is constantly going to devalue vis-à-vis the currency of the surplus country. Why? Because you have a constant trade deficit vis-à-vis the surplus country. So that's why the Italian lira, before the euro era, kept on devaluing vis-à-vis the Deutschmark. Because the Germans were selling more to the Italians than the Italians were selling to the Germans. Every time the Italian lira devalued, Italian exports to Germany were boosted slightly, and imports from Germany to Italy declined. So that kept the relationship between the two economies in check. When you join them together, that stops. And what happens is this. The net exports of Germany towards, let's say, let me go back to Greece, forget Italy for a moment. The net exports of Germany to Greece, commodities like Volkswagens, another example at random. Yeah? So, Volkswagen goes to Greece, what happens? Money goes from Greece to Volkswagen. Volkswagen puts it in a bank account. So, the larger the trade surplus of a country in a monetary union, the greater the glut of savings in its banking system. What do bankers hate more than anything? Idle cash. To have cash swashing around in their bank, which they do not lend out. Now, if there is an abundance of money in a place like Germany, the price of money in that country is going to be low. What's the price of money? It's the interest rate. So interest rates tended to be low in places like Germany and higher in places like Greece because of this imbalance in trade. So the Frankfurt bankers had every incentive in the world to lend the money to Greeks. Greek companies, Greek households, the Greek state, anybody. Just take it. Now, before the euro, they had to think twice. Because the Greeks had something called the drachma, which had a tendency to nosedive. So if you have nice, fat Deutschmarks, and you are Deutsche Bank or Finanzbank, you think twice before you give it to a Greek, whose income will come in drachmas, whose Deutschmark value keeps falling. But if suddenly the Greeks get the Deutschmark, or you can call it the euro, suddenly you think, come here, Kostas. How many apartments do you own? 3. Nice collateral. Take a big fat loan. So, let me now also tell a story. That's a true story. It was 2011. The crisis had already erupted. And I was traveling to the United States from, I don't remember, I think it was Frankfurt. And I was sitting next to a chap called Franz. You can imagine he was German, and he was a former banker. And he said to me something quite startling. Initially, I didn't understand why he was saying this to me. He said, you know what? Before the euro, I lived a charmed life. Once the euro came in, my life wasn't worth living. And that's why now I'm an ex-banker. I had a stroke, I had to leave. The euro did this to you? How come? I mean, I understand why a Greek would say that, but a German banker? He said, listen, before 2000, I would go to places like Madrid, Dublin, Greece, and to speak to clients. The clients were corporates were government officials, were bankers, local bankers, who wanted to borrow from his bank. And they would fate me. They would take me to the opera, they would take me to the fanciest restaurants, they would give me their business plans, they will explain to me why they are creditworthy. I would take all this stuff back with me. I would spend a week or so in leisure to pore over those, the data and the track record of these potential debtors, and then I would make a recommendation to my board, and the board would decide either to grant this loan or not. But once the euro started coming out of ATMs, that was all over. Suddenly, we had quotas. We had to lend many hundreds of millions every week, each one of us. And if we didn't reach those quotas, we would suffer the consequences. HQ from Frankfurt was on our case. And of course, the reason is this, that the Eurozone's creation made the imbalances greater, and the glut of euros in Frankfurt and then in Paris, because the French banks were always more efficient at convincing the Germans to allow them to be the conduits of credit creation, but that's another story. So the other side of the story of the great surpluses within the Eurozone of the surplus countries was the great debts of the deficit countries. It is impossible, on the one hand, to celebrate your own surplus in a monetary union while castigating others for having a deficit. It's like me lending you £10 and then castigating you for having borrowed £10. It's the height of hypocrisy. I mentioned John Maynard Keynes's economic consequences of Mr. Churchill. You'll find all this in there. His criticism of the gold standard that Mr. Churchill had just joined, or had made Britain join, was precisely this, that by joining in a fixed exchange rate regime, without mechanisms for absorbing shocks when they come, and mechanisms for preventing the build-up of gross imbalances, you're asking for trouble. And trouble did come in 1929. And it was then that Keynes came back and explained why, after the implosion of 1929, the market didn't do the trick. Now, if you have unsold stuff, let's say you are a greengrocer, and you have unsold potatoes, what's the best way of getting rid of them? You reduce the price. And you keep reducing it until you sell out. But Keynes's point was that it's true about potatoes, not true about wages or labor, and it's not true about money. Now imagine you are an entrepreneur and you're thinking, in the middle of a crisis, should I make a significant investment in a new production facility? Now that wage costs are low, capital goods are very easy to find, second-hand, very cheaply during a crisis. You are tossing over in your sleep, sweating, worrying about it. Should I do it or should I not do it? And you decide to switch on the BBC in the middle of the night, World Service, because it's the only one that still has talk, sensible talk in the middle of the night. And you hear the news that the Bank of England is thinking of reducing interest rates massively to 0. What do? Do you think, right, fantastic. It means I should invest because the price of money comes down, the price of my borrowing money to invest in this facility is coming down, I'll do it. Now, with potatoes, you hear the potato price comes down, you buy more of them. Do you do the same thing with labor if you're an entrepreneur? Maybe another piece of news on the same business program on the BBC World Service is the trades unions, fed up with unemployment, have adopted austerity, and they are prepared to reduce Greek-style wages by 40%. Well, you think, oh, good, my wage costs are going to be going down. But does this mean that this person is going to wake up in the morning and think, right, that's it, I'm investing? Keynes' point was that at that point, it's much more likely that he'll think, oh my God, for trades unions to be willing to reduce their wages by 40%, and for the Bank of England at the same time to be reducing the price of money, the interest rate, things must be terrible. What does it depend upon whether he will invest or not, or she? It depends on whether these entrepreneurs believe that there are other entrepreneurs who will also invest. Because if there aren't, then there will not be sufficient demand for the products, the goodies that will come off the production line of the facility they're creating. Now, these were all ideas that came out of this place. At that time, this kind of analysis was considered to be heretical. Small aside, it's a kind of analysis I took to the Eurogroup with me, and it was still considered heretical. The point about major crises like the ones that hit the Eurozone due to its faulty architecture is that once you have a series of insolvencies in the deficit regions, within those deficit regions, austerity, cutbacks, increase the size of the insolvency. Think of what happened to Greece in May 2010, because of course my advice was ignored. Remember, I had quoted Keynes that a bailout agreement where the Greek state would take on the largest loan in human history, 110 billion euros. That was the largest loan ever, in absolute terms, not in relative terms, on conditions that would shrink our income by 25-28%. You only need to be a 5-year-old to understand, or maybe 10-year-old, to understand that this cannot end well. If you're a banker, the reason why you're borrowing is because you can't make your repayments. So your income is not enough for you to make your repayments. So how is this going to help? How is it going to help if you take on a huge loan on condition that your income shrinks further? This is a Versailles Treaty. And it is a Versailles Treaty because not only would that, with mathematical precision, collapse Greek incomes and push Greece into a debt deflationary cycle whose only beneficiaries were the Nazis. In Greek parliament today, the third largest party is a Nazi party, not a neo-Nazi party, a Nazi party. There's nothing neo about it. They're completely unreconstructed. They still have Hitler there, you know, they have the swastika, they have everything. Which is what happens when a proud nation is humiliated and pushed into a debt deflationary cycle that forces it to be stuck in a Great Depression. So the Greek state took on this huge loan, and it was clear to me back then that we are not only going to collapse as a society, as a social economy, but that would spawn a domino effect that would take the crisis to other parts of the Union. It wasn't clear exactly what the sequence would be, but it was abundantly clear, at least to me, that it would. And the only reason why it was abundantly clear to me was because I had read Keynes. Because Keynes had described exactly that process for the gold standard. And the Eurozone was the gold standard writ large in Europe in the 2000s. Keynes had described it as a dangerous and barbarous relic of a bygone era. These were his words, and they fit precisely what we are observing now in the Eurozone. Today, if you are running a pension fund in Germany, you are in deep trouble. Do you know why? Because your yields, the interest rates on your investments, the investments that the pension fund makes, these are the contributions of the members of the pension fund. And the pension fund has to invest them in order to make a healthy return from which to pay pensions. Those interest rates are negative now. Why? Because this contagion that Keynes had so succinctly portrayed and described, and which, as a disciple, well, I'm not even considering myself to be a Keynesian, but it doesn't matter. One has to be eclectic and pick and choose ideas that make sense from those who've come before and who happen to be a little bit more intelligent. Just having had this experience of being baptized, if you want, in the Cambridge tradition allowed me to see that which our governments in the Eurozone pretended that they couldn't see or actually couldn't see. Let me say a few words as to why this happened. Because I'd never accept explanations of intellectual failure on the basis of faulty DNA, that people are dumb, and therefore that somehow they fail intellectually. There's always something different at work, some other process which determines this failure. Let's take a brief look at the European Union, at Brussels, the Brussels bureaucracy, which is portraying itself, if you want, as the government of Europe, of the European Union. And let's compare and contrast it very briefly with the government of Britain, the government of Canada, and so on. A government in a fully functioning nation or federation is the result of many years, decades, centuries of conflict between different social groups. Initially in Britain, think of the Magna Carta, it was between the barons and the king. Then other kinds of landowners came in, then the merchants, then the proletariat. Class conflict. And there is the need for a political institution or a set of political institutions, a network of political institutions that balances out these conflicts. This is how governments and constitutions have emerged. This is not how the European Union emerged. The European Union emerged in the late 1940s, 1950, 1951, 52, as a cartel. Initially, it was called the Community of Coal and Steel. It was a cartel of heavy industry located around the circle, or if you want the ellipse, of Germany, Belgium, Holland, France, and Northern Italy. The heavy industries united to prevent competition between them, to create an oligopolistic cartel with stable prices and no competition between them, and on the basis of that to build peace in Europe. And the bureaucrats in Brussels, what was their job? It was effectively they were the administration, the administrators of that cartel. Later on, other social groups, other industries were inducted into this cartel. The French farmers through the Common Agricultural Policy, and of course the financiers. Now a cartel, think of OPEC, the oil cartel. In order to be maintained, it has to avoid price competition. This is the whole point. Now the thing is that if you have French companies, German companies, Italian companies, and so on, and each one of them deals with a jurisdiction where there is a different currency, if these currencies move around a lot, fluctuate a lot with in relation to one another, then that destroys effectively the foundation of the cartel. This is why Europe had to have fixed exchange rates. Now in the first 20 years of the European Union it did, courtesy of the Americans. It was called the Bretton Woods system, which John Maynard Keynes played a significant role in designing. It is very interesting to read the transcripts of the conversations in 1944 at Bretton Woods. And had his blueprint been adopted by the Americans as it was, the world, I am convinced, could have been a far better place. But that's another lecture, which I'm not going to give. So, in order to stabilize Brussels, which was the administration of this cartel, after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, under President Richard Nixon, when suddenly Europe became unhinged. It became unhinged from the US dollar, and then started becoming unhinged within itself, endogenously. So the Deutschmark started going up, following an upward trend very quickly because of the trade surpluses of Germany, of West Germany back then. The Italian lira started coming down following the dollar, which was also coming down. That would have torn apart the cartel. This is why the leaders of Europe, from the very beginning, the Werner report that I mentioned, or actually Nicholas Kaldor mentioned in the quotation that I gave you, this is why they started trying to fix exchange rates. First, we had the so-called snake in 1972. That failed. Then in 1978, the French and the Germans, Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, got together in 1978, when was it, in Aachen, and they signed the European monetary system. Then that developed a secondary mechanism, the European exchange rate mechanism, from which Britain extricated itself, fortunately for Britain, in 1992, when another Cambridge person, Norman Lamont, sang in the bath famously, celebrating quietly the failure, in inverted commas, of pound sterling to stay within that fixed exchange rate regime. And when that failure demonstrated, even to Jacques Delors, whom I mentioned before, the president of the European Commission at the time, that it was impossible to fix exchange rates, they decided, well, let's do away with them, let's replace them by one currency. Falling, in other words, in the trap that Keynes described as a dangerous and barbarous relic of a bygone era. The result was that when our generation's 1929 hit, 2008, the Eurozone resembled a fine riverboat that is launched on a calm ocean, trying to cross the ocean and reach the United States or whatever, or wherever. It looks splendid until the first storm hits. And when the storm hits, it starts taking water in. And the poor people in the decks, inside, deep down, below, are the ones that take water first. These are the deficit regions of the Eurozone. The Eurozone had absolutely no chance of surviving in the long run, and still doesn't, if it remains constructed the way it was, as a reflection of the gold standard of the 1930s. Greece was the flimsiest part of this faulty edifice. And like any faulty edifice that receives a shock wave that it was not designed to sustain, the flimsiest part starts unraveling. So Greece is not important to you folks, it's important to us Greeks. But it does matter if you see it as the canary in the mine that warns the miners of the impending disaster. Greece matters only to the extent that it reflects the architectural flaws of the Eurozone. And you may say to me, well, why should we care? We're not in the Eurozone. Well, I'm glad you're not in the Eurozone. And the reason why so many of us continental Europeans live in the United Kingdom, I'm not one of them, but there are many of us, is because the Eurozone is fragmenting, it is deconstructing. Unlike Britain, which still has the Bank of England supporting the Chancellor of the Exchequer, whoever that person might be, and however competent or incompetent he may be. No particular value judgment here. Let me say a few words about our negotiation. I shall remind you of how it was portrayed, and then I will tell you how it was. And then we can take it on further in the discussion that will follow. The way it was portrayed as a debt crisis. A particular country or set of countries, including Spain, Portugal, Ireland, took on more debt than they could afford. They fibbed about the level of the debt and the level of the deficit, Greek statistics, let me remind you. And then when the crisis came, the ants of Europe, the northerners, the Calvinist north, had to bail out the grasshoppers of the south out of solidarity and out of a sense of obligation to keeping Europe together. And then the grasshoppers of the south, and in particular of a pipsqueak country called Greece, had the audacity to elect the party of the radical left who in turn had the audacity to go and ask for debt relief and for a diminution of the austerity which is and ought to be the right price one pays for profligacy. This is how it was presented. And personally, I was presented as the minister in charge of seeking more loans, seeking relief from belt tightening, and demanding my people's right to returning to the bad old ways of deficit spending. That's how it was portrayed. Let me tell you how it was, at least from my perspective. I was elected on a very simple promise to my constituents in Greece and to my fellow Europeans, that I shall not sign any loan agreement which gives more money to my state from European citizens on conditions that guarantee, as Ahab quoted Amartya Sen to say, under conditions that guarantee that we will not be able to repay those loans. This extending and pretending was what previous ministers of finance did before me. It was what the Troika was insisting that we continue doing. Now I come to the question that I think Ahab's point, well, actually Amartya Sen's point, raises. Remember what the point was? That this is the very first time in history, and I believe it is the very first time in history, where creditors were imposing upon debtors new loans on conditions that guaranteed that the creditors would not get their money back. Now, why would they do that? Well, let me tell you why they would do it. Firstly, in 2010, when the first bailout was given, the one I had warned against using Keynes as an example, as my ammunition. That first bailout was not a bailout for the Greek state. It was not a bailout for the Greek government. It was a bailout for Deutsche Bank, Société Générale, BNP Paribas, Finanzbank, the banks of Germany and France that had lent to Greek banks, to the Greek state, and so on and so forth. Remember, at around the same time, General Motors went bankrupt. Do you remember that? You don't remember that. You're too young to remember anything. So in 2009, General Motors went bankrupt. So today General Motors is flourishing. Why? Because they haircut 90% of its debt and restructured the company. So a therapeutic haircut, when you have an insolvency, a bankruptcy, there are two things you can do. Just shut down the whole thing, say it's finished, like Lehman Brothers, disappeared from the face of the earth. Well, you can't exactly do that with a nation state. That would be too final a solution. Or you do the General Motors thing, which is you restructure the debt, you restructure the company, in the case of Greece, the economy, you reform it, and then it starts growing so that you can repay as much of the previous debt as you could. They didn't do this in 2010. They didn't do this in 2012. If you don't do that and you extend and pretend, this is what rogue bankers do. Rogue bankers are bankers who are themselves bankrupt. So what they do is this. Let's say that I'm a broke banker and you owe me £1 million and you can't pay it back. But if I report to the authorities, to the Bank of England, to my supervisors, that I have minus £1 million in my asset books, then they will have problems with me. So I don't want to report that. So you know what I do? I give you another £1 million credit so that you can use it to repay the previous one. But that adds more debt to your existing unpayable debt. It makes you more bankrupt than before, but at least it preserves this semblance of solvency. This is what they did with Greece, only worse, because I would never ask you to reduce your income. In the case of Greece, they asked us to reduce our income through massive austerity. So that was what was happening before I took over the ministry. And I went to the Eurogroup and I said, let's get one thing straight. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm not here in anything other than a consensual mood. We're a tiny country, we're a bankrupt country, I'm the Minister of Finance of a bankrupt nation. I'm not here to dictate to you what should happen, even in Greece. But I'm telling you, don't ask me to take on a new loan until we agree on a reform package and a restructuring of debt package that will render our economy viable. It will give us a significant, statistically significant probability of recovery. Only then am I going to commit my people to another 50, 60, 70, 80 billion euros. And I was considered to be recalcitrant, and I was considered to be rude. So be it. As I said, I wear their criticisms with pride. But why did they want to do that? In 2010, we know why. It is because they wanted to cover up the fact that they were bailing out their own banks. Mrs. Merkel could not go a second time in a year to the Bundestag, the federal parliament, to ask for another bailout loan for the banks. A year before, she had asked for 500 billion euros. Yes, you've heard correctly. In 2009, just like you had bailouts here, right? The German government pushed through the Bundestag a bailout of the German banks of 500 billion. This was political poison for Mrs. Merkel, understandably. She didn't want to do it. I understand why she didn't want to do it. Like Gordon Brown didn't want to do it here, like Barack Obama didn't want to do it in the United States. But then they discovered that when Greece was going under, probably Portugal would go under, probably Spain would go under, and all these countries together owed more than €1 trillion to German and French banks. To prevent that, they decided to bail out the Greek state so that that bailout money would go to the German banks under the heading of Solidarity for Greece. The first Greek bailout was 110 billion. Of it, 91% went to the French and particularly to the German banks. 91%. Why didn't I stay in government after the 5th of July? Why did I resign? Because I tried to be true to my promise, to my colleagues in the Eurogroup, to European citizens, and primarily to my Greek voters, to the Greek electorate, that I would not sign another unsustainable, non-viable, extend and pretend rogue loan. And what happened afterwards? My successor signed another such loan to the tune of 85 billion. Let me ask you a question, a rhetorical question. I'll answer it too, don't worry. Out of that 85 billion, how much will the Greek state receive? The answer is a radical number. 0. 0. And we're taking this new loan under conditions which guarantee the crashing of what is left of the productive capacity of the Greek state. Let me give you just a very brief example. Next month, every business in Greece will have to pay, within November of 2015, the total sum of their expected tax for 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what you do to a country if you want to crash it. Question. Am I a conspiracy theorist? Does somebody want to crash my country? Why would somebody want to crash my country? Well, let me tell you that the beauty of having spent a few months in Brussels and in Frankfurt and in Berlin was that I had an opportunity to do something that as a theorist I never had a chance to do. As a theorist, you put forward hypotheses and you try to test them either through logic, deductively, or inductively through empirics. But the beauty of this is that I didn't have to imagine what their intentions were because they told me. One of my favorite scenes in a Woody Allen movie is Annie Hall, where he and his girlfriend, Diane Keaton, I believe, was standing in a queue waiting to go and see some French movie. And the people in front of him are having an argument as to what the meaning of the movie is and what the French director wanted to say. And Woody Allen walks up to them and says, "I'm sorry, but this is not what he meant. He meant something completely different." And they start this argument. And Woody Allen goes, hang on a second. He goes and brings the director. He says, "Can you please tell them what you meant to say?" So this is the kind of experience I had and which I'm sharing with you. So let me cut to the chase and tell you what the true objective is, as I understand it and as I have discussed it with those who imposed this deal upon us. Not with fellow travelers, not with comrades, but those who imposed the deal. It's very simple. They understand that which Keynes had warned about, that which I have outlined here, that this Eurozone, the way it's created, is not sustainable. They understand it. They understand that it's very difficult to create a political union on top of the monetary union during this crisis, as Kaldor had predicted in 1970. But they also understand that they're correct on this, that if we allow this terrible Eurozone to collapse and to fragment, to go back to our currencies, we will return to a postmodern version of the 1930s. It's one thing to say we should not have created the Eurozone. It's quite another to say we should fragment it and go back to the cocoon of national currencies. When you break this up, what you end up with is massive recession in the surplus countries and stagflation, that is a combination of inflation and unemployment in the deficit countries. You, here in Britain, do not need this from the continent. You do not want the working poor in Germany to become unemployed poor in Germany. You do not want stagflation in France. This is not in the interests of the British people. So they understand that. And the blueprint that some of them, Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble in particular, have in mind is to create a smaller, perhaps smaller Eurozone through the expulsion of a country like Greece, maybe, but definitely one where there is a Leviathan in the center of the Eurogroup, the president of the Eurogroup. I call this person the way that his, should be his, not hers. Authority was described to me, was envisaged as a Leviathan who has a capacity to say no to national budgets. This is the model which is now dominant in the mind of the most dominant forces, especially in Germany, as to how to transform the European Monetary Union. Now, this may be a political union, but it's not anything like a democratic political union, because it's not a federation. In a federation, you have a common budget that the federal treasurer is administering, and then he is answerable to a parliament that has the right to dismiss this person. That particular form would not be consistent with the principles of liberal democracy. And in my estimation, as an economist, it's not even consistent with the principles of sound macroeconomics. Why am I telling you this now? Because it is the only way to understand what happened to our government and why our negotiation was crushed by the powers that be. How? Paris is resisting this model. Paris understands, the French government understands, that this is all about a president of the Eurogroup who is effectively speaking on behalf of the German finance ministry, having the right to veto the French national budget. And why were we crushed? Because it was considered that yielding to us, allowing us to breathe, giving us a macroeconomic plan that made sense, would take the pressure off the French to acquiesce to this particularly ironclad and authoritarian model of political union for the Eurozone. In short, Greece was collateral damage, while Germany and France are fighting it out in order to determine how to convert a totally unsustainable Eurozone into something more sustainable. What does this mean for all of us? You have a referendum coming up for Europe. It may very well transpire from this kind of presentation that Brussels is an awful place, and the further away you get from it, the better. Indeed, there is probably no worse critic of Brussels than I am. I've experienced it in my bone, on my skin. It is insufferable. This is why I think it is important that somebody like me looks at you in the eye and say, but this is not a reason to get out. Because you can't escape the European Union even if you vote to get out of it. You are still going to have to live in a world where at your doorstep the largest single market is dominated by this anti-democratic, authoritarian, irrational, inefficient bureaucracy. What I suggest to you is that we all join forces, the Brits, yes, even the French, the Greeks, even the Germans, and we all embark upon a campaign of civil disobedience towards Brussels within the European Union. Let me finish by quoting Gandhi. Once he was asked what he thought about European civilization, and he answered, "It would be a splendid idea." Well, can we pull it off? Can we pull off that splendid idea? I believe we can, but not without a massive dose of democratization in the center of Europe. And without Britain, I don't believe we can do it. Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to thank you for that. And as a survivor of Cambridge economics tripos, I can say that was probably unlike any economics lecture I have ever lived through. Now I think the time has come to put you on the back foot and to ask for questions from the floor, to interrogate you on some of the statements you made and some of the assumptions, some of the actions which happened over the summer. And just to get the ball rolling, I'll ask just one question, which occurred to me when you were talking about Keynes. You mentioned Keynes a lot. The only thing that I remember from my tripos on Keynes saying was, if you owe a bank £100, you've got a problem. If you owe a bank £1 million, the bank has a problem. Now you owed the $320 billion.
Yep.
Not personally, the country did. In principle then, according to Keynes, you should have been in a very, very strong negotiating position. Mm-hmm. What went wrong?
Well, I think we were in less of a strong negotiating position than you're saying. Look, if we wanted to use Grexit, exit from the Eurozone, as a bargaining chip, yes, that would be quite a powerful one. We didn't have a mandate to do this, and I didn't want to use it because I didn't believe in it, and I also believe in credible threats. You should only make a threat that you are prepared to see through if the condition that you are attaching to unleashing it is not met. Why didn't I want Grexit? I didn't want Grexit for a very simple reason. While I lost a lot of friends in the 1990s in Greece simply because I was against joining the Eurozone. So nobody can accuse me of being a Europhile, or at least a Europhile as in the Euro currency file. Yeah? I am a Europeanist, but not a Euro currency file. It's one thing to say you shouldn't have gotten in, it's quite another to say you should have gotten out. Because let me remind you, when Nono Lamont got you out of the exchange rate mechanism, you still had the pound in your pockets. So what he did was simply to make the decision to cut the link between the pound and the Deutschmark. That's what effectively the ERM did. It linked the pound to the Deutschmark. When the Argentinians got out of their union, monetary union with the United States dollar, they had the peso in their pockets. There was a one-to-one correspondence between 1 peso, $1. What happened was when they had a situation similar to us, they just severed it. Now, imagine that Lamont had not taken you out of the ERM and eventually had joined the euro. And now you're in the euro with us. Just for a moment, right? Imagine. How do you get out? How do you get out? You don't have a currency to devalue. You have the foreign currency. If you want to get out, the money in your pocket becomes the foreign currency. So, just to cut a long story short, my credible threat was not Grexit, and therefore default on the whole amount that we owed. No, it was something far more sensible, I believe. Part of our debt, 27 out of these 320 billions, were owed to the European Central Bank, which is quite absurd, but anyway, it's true. That debt was written not in English law, but in Greek law, which meant that I, as the minister, had the right, the legal authority, to reschedule it, to just change the contract of it, to say instead of being paid back in 2015, 2016, it will be paid back in 3016. It was up to me to do. That was a credible threat. And what would the trigger be? The trigger would be, that's what I was intending. That was my recommendation to my cabinet from even before it was formed, from even before the general election that we won. That if they dare shut down our banks in order to asphyxiate us and torture us into submission, if they dared close down our banks, we would do that. Now, you may say, what's 27 billion? The answer is nothing. Pipsqueak money. When the ECB, as part of quantitative easing, is printing 60 billion every month, no one's going to notice it, right? No, it's not true. Because even though the sum is not great, legally, it would be devastating for the central bank. Now, why would I want to do something devastating towards my central bank? I wouldn't. But if the central bank devastated me by shutting down our banks, which is what they did, then I think it was perfectly reasonable to retaliate with this haircut. Unfortunately, even though we had decided in the inner cabinet that this is what we would do, the moment they shut down our banks, I was outvoted. Again, I was in a minority of one, and the result is I resigned.
Okay. Well, now I'd like to open it up to the floor. And I'd like to tell you that Yanis is quite a tough person, so give him a hard time.
Yeah, give me a hard time.
Okay. Do we have a roving microphone?
Hello. You mentioned tonight that you believe in a pan-European movement to democratize the European Union, and you kind of characterize yourself as a Europeanist. That's a view I share. However, I find it hard to believe, given that there still isn't a European political identity that people were hoping for would take hold to create a pan-European movement. How do you suppose that, especially in a time where we're seeing such a fallback to a nationalist identity, given problems such as the refugee crisis, to create the political impetus at even the public level to try to create this large-scale change you're proposing?
Well, this is a brilliant question, because it's the issue. The problem with Europe, if you compare it to the United States, think of the United States history of the last 200 years. Every time they had a crisis, they consolidated. They got closer together. They created institutions that bonded them better together. We had the first big crisis, and now there are awful, frightful centrifugal forces tearing us apart. It is true, and this is a standard argument amongst Eurosceptics in this country, that we have many different languages, we have many different nationalities, many different identities. It's not the same thing to create the solidarity which is necessary to put together such a movement in a European continent as it is in a village, in a county, in a country. That is quite right. However, think about it. Before the euro, Europeans were coming closer together despite their different languages and different identities. So what we need to do today in order to forge a we the people for Europe, something that the Americans immediately think of. The American political system has a long list of demerits, but at least they have this sensation, the sense of we the people, something we need to create. How do we create it? Through political action, through banding together for the purposes of a well thought out minimalist, moderate agenda. So let me give you an example of what we could ask for. For the very short term, we could demand of our politicians and the bureaucrats in Brussels that every time David Cameron goes to Brussels in the European Union Council, or every time a Minister of Finance, like I used to be, goes to the Eurogroup, that all these meetings should be live streamed so that we can hear and watch them talk to one another. Imagine the effect that would have both on us and on them. How much better governance would be if we had transparency. Imagine that every time our representatives on behalf of the European Union enter into negotiations, trade deal negotiations on TTIP. Imagine that these chapters were put on the internet. Now, how about having a political movement in Europe that agitates for this? Just beginning to create it is our chance for creating a political European identity. Now, you may say this is utopian. Think of the alternative. What is the alternative? Britain to get out? Us to go to the drachma and also get out? Then Scotland will leave Britain, no doubt, in my mind. Okay, so we'll start dividing and multiplying. Belgium will be broken up between the Flemish areas that will go with a Deutschmark zone and the Wallonia that will go with a whatever franc zone, you know, a Catholic currency. And what happens then? We will recreate the conditions of the 1930s, where devaluation, where antagonism is going to be rampant at a time when we have an imploding Middle East with ISIS. We have a world economy that is barely struggling to retain its poise, already suffering from the inability of Europe to recover. And we're going to have a Russia under Vladimir Putin, for whom this fragmentation is going to be a great birthday gift. So we have a moral duty to try for the impossible and make it possible. The European identity that you were talking about.
So I think a question from him.
Thank you. So let me just start by thanking you for complimenting us so much in terms of what we were. We have evolved, and we probably don't emphasize some of the points that you raised as much in our in what we do. But one of the things we do quite a lot, actually these days, is on negotiation. And we, things that we teach is that when you get into something, you actually try to see the end point and then work backwards and then try to devise your strategy in terms of negotiation. And I'm not Greek. I just follow the Greek news. And when your party came in, after the election last year, and what we heard was that you were going to get a better deal from the Greeks, for the Greeks, by negotiating somehow in a better way for the Greeks. Mm-hmm. And, most of people outside thought, well, good luck. You may be right on the causes exactly as you described, but, it will be a very hard job. Couldn't you see, and your negotiation went on from, early 2015 until the August, I think until July, August. So 6-7 months. Wasn't the kind of positions that you took, wasn't it kind of, couldn't you see that this would be the end game? That's to say, at some point, you might be a minority of one within your own cabinet. And even the one threat that you have, you can't actually pull it off. And the end result is that actually the Greek banks were closed. So, so I just want to kind of press you on that.
Mm-hmm. No,
that don't you see that you might have made huge mistakes that have been very costly for the Greeks. In terms of, when we think about bargaining and negotiation, we have to think about, what I can get away with and what happens if the whole thing falls apart. And, the newspapers described you as a game theorist. At least in the UK, it started with some journalists in the FT, and described the game that you were playing as a chicken game, that there are two possible things that you can end up, and you're pushing one direction. But it was more, you were doing this, it was actually a bargaining game, a negotiation game for about 6-7 months. And do you think that the end results, the Greeks are better off now than if they were actually in early January 2015, you had taken a more tactful side, knowing that you can't get away with it?
I was not involved. Thank you for your question. It's an extremely pertinent question. Okay, if my intention was to get the same kind of program which existed before I was elected, only slightly softer, or a variant of it, I would not have stood for government, because I was not interested in that, because any mild variation on the theme would still leave the country insolvent, and would still lead to the eventual acceleration of the debt deflationary cycle. That was my view. We can sit down and I can show you why, but that's another matter. But I'll concentrate on the point you make about negotiations and about the, if you want, the analytical aspect of it, and also address the point that you raised regarding my position in the Eurogroup and then becoming minority of one in the inner cabinet. Well, the most important thing to understand about the negotiations we had was that we didn't have any negotiations. There were no negotiations, ever. A negotiation, the way you understand it, and I used to understand it as a theorist, is when you have a pie and you have two or more parties bargaining over how to distribute that pie between them. And there's a ticking clock, or you have sealed bids, or whatever. That never happened. It didn't happen because the troika of lenders were determined not to negotiate with us until our liquidity ran dry, and then they shut the banks down. Was I aware of that or not? I can show you a document, a briefing that I had sent to Alexis Tsipras, who is today Prime Minister, a year before we were elected, in which I outlined that the strategy of the troika, if we confront them, will be not to negotiate with us and to continue the process of, a war of attrition, a period of attrition. And the reason why there was an attrition was because we had repayments to meet to the IMF for the first 6 months of our government. There were disbursements that were meant to come from them. They discontinued the disbursements and they demanded the repayments. And we kept making the repayments up until a certain point in good faith, hoping that we would have a decent negotiation, or signaling, not just to them, but to electorates all over Europe and the world, and the constituent members of the IMF, who are not the same as the Brussels technocrats, that we meant to negotiate in good faith. And I had said from the beginning that the revelation of our type, is going to happen only once they close our banks down at the end of that period, to find out if we mean business. And what meaning business meant was 3 things. I've written extensively about them. One I've mentioned, the higher cutting of the bonds that would destroy quantitative easing throughout Europe, and therefore it was a seriously credible threat. Secondly, the creation of a parallel payment system, digital payment system in euro-denominated tax-backed credits. And thirdly, legislation by which we altered the governance of the Central Bank of Greece, which is part of the euro system. This was the plan. These 3 weapons were held in abeyance, were meant to be held in abeyance, while the discussions, I don't call them negotiations, And let me just say once more, let me give you another example of why there were not negotiations. I would go to Brussels and I would sit down with the representatives of the Troika, Mr. Moscovici, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Benoit Quéré, or Mr. Draghi from the European Central Bank. They were our creditors, that was the Troika. These were the heads of the Troika. And say, okay, where do we start? Shall we start from the tax system? Help us fight tax evasion. Let's design a tax system that makes more sense. Reduce tax rates, because Greece had very high tax rates and very low tax takes. So let's reduce tax rates in order to increase the tax base, and at the same time have more surveillance, have more enforcement. They would hear our views and say, yes, but what are you going to do about pensions? Then we would explain to them what we're going to do about pensions. They say, oh, no, we need a fact-finding mission to go to Athens to find out what the latest situation is with your pension funds. I'll take 2 weeks. Then we would get together. We would put proposals forward to them. They would snipe back by saying that our proposals do not make the pension system in Greece viable for the next 50 years. I said, well, is the German pension system viable in the next 50 years? When you make the German pension system viable, then come back to me and ask me. I had just been elected. They wanted me to make the pension system viable ad infinitum. Yeah? At some point, they will say, yes, well, what are you going to do about privatizations? You get the gist? It was like a cat chasing its own tail. Eventually, we'll come back to the tax system and then move on again. And they were doing this, effectively wasting time while our liquidity was drying up and while the central bank was only increasing ELA fractionally in order to create agitation and uncertainty in the mind of depositors so that they would enhance a bank run which they had started before we even got elected. It was a clear war of attrition, totally in line with my expectations as I had written them down in a secret briefing paper to my political leader at the time. On the question of the actual outcome, I truly believe that the reason why we lost this game, if you want to think of it as a game, was because we deviated from the strategy that we had set off on at the beginning. And the strategy we had set off at the beginning was not a chicken game. I wrote actually an op-ed in the New York Times immediately after I became finance minister with the title, No Time for Games. And I explained why game theory is absolutely irrelevant in what we were doing, and that a chicken game strategy was not my strategy. But I'm not going to elaborate on this further. Just to say that the strategy that I had recommended to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister had accepted was one of telling our colleagues in the Eurogroup that we are open to any reform program that is consistent with a debt structure that stabilizes Greek nominal GDP, which creates within the next 2 years a nominal GDP rise, which in conjunction with appropriate small primary surplus targets would encourage investment back into the country, that we would need to have a bad bank to deal with the non-performing loans, and a development bank in which public assets would be used as collateral for creating homegrown investment. Privatization would go ahead as long as there were certain minimum requirements fulfilled so as not to have a fire sale that is completely wasteful. This minimalist, moderate, not at all left-wing political program, which I worked on together, and it's co-signed by rabid Marxists like Larry Summers, like Norman Lamont, like Thomas Mager, the former chief economist of Deutsche Bank, This was going to be our blueprint. We wanted to have negotiations on this, discussions on them. We were open to any suggestion as long as the suggestion that came from them, as I said before, gave us a statistically significant probability, if we agreed on it, of recovery. And that we would stick to this. And that we would simply not budge even if they shut down the banks. And if they shut down the banks, we would haircut those bonds and start a parallel payment system as long as it took. And if we needed a backing, a mandate from the population through a referendum, we would do it. Unfortunately, that did not work, and this is where I miscalculated, and you're right, because my own prime minister buckled towards the end of April and effectively surrendered austerity, accepted very large primary surpluses as part of the negotiation behind my back, which effectively killed off the strategy. And then from that moment onwards, we were going to be crushed. There's no doubt about that, unless we had the last chance of activating those 3 triggers that I told you. By that stage, my side had given up the fight. I am totally convinced of a different outcome had the strategy that I had proposed and which was accepted had been followed through. I cannot prove it. This is the problem with real life, is we are not in an experimental lab. I sleep very well at night. And the fact that Greece is now worse off than it was when we took over, which is true, at the level of the economy, not at the discursive level, not at the level of the dignity that we've given to the Greek people, to which you cannot put no value. The fact that we are worse off, however, economically, pains me, but we would be worse off anyway, even if we weren't elected. If you look at the trajectory of Greek nominal national income, it was always coming down. If anything, during my time, GDP grew by 0.8% in real terms. The previous lot showed 0.2% increase in real GDP. But I'm not going to take I'm not going to claim this as a success. It was a terrible failure. Why? Because we are in a Great Depression. Real GDP was going up during the previous government and our government only because the denominator was falling faster than the numerator. That is, we had more deflation than we had recession. Yeah? So if I were a good politician, I would be saying, oh, look, under my watch, in my watch, we had the highest real GDP growth of the last 8 years. No, it was a disaster. But let me tell you this, finally. On the 28th of October, the anniversary is coming up, of 1940, the Greek people said no to an ultimatum presented by Mussolini. The result was that the country was devastated by an occupation that eliminated hundreds of thousands of Greeks. I can assure you, sir, that no Greek regrets having put up a fight against the ironclad idiocy of those in Europe who are trying to play silly games with the lives of whole populations.
Yanis, thank you. That is all we've got time for tonight, I'm afraid, unless anyone has a very, very quick question with a very, very quick answer. Yes, you've got one. Got one? Right, go ahead.
From Emeritus Professor Bob Rowthorne, the foremost Marxist economist that Cambridge has produced for many, many years.
And a great friend.
Yes, we were together in the University of Sydney. Well, I have a very simple question. It seems to me one of the problems in your non-negotiations is you didn't have a credible threat. Do you think it would have been a credible threat to say that without a better response from the major powers in Europe, Greece would leave the euro but stay in the euro, leave the eurozone but stay within the EU and abrogate some of its debts?
No, I don't think so. Because, as I said, it's not a credible threat to threaten your partners with a devaluation which must be announced 12 months before it happens. Because when you don't have your own currency, you need to create it to devalue it. And that takes 12 months. So how can anybody take me seriously if I'm threatening them with a devaluation that will take the country back to the Stone Age? So the credible threat was the bonds owned by the ECB. Realize this. The Eurozone today would collapse within a week without the QE program of Mario Draghi. The QE program of Mario Draghi is constantly challenged by the Bundesbank, the Central Bank of Germany. The Central Bank of Germany has deposited 120 pages at the Constitutional Court of Germany against OMT and QE, these two programs. The ECB's, Mr. Draghi's defense, which prevents the Constitutional Court of Germany from declaring what the ECB is doing to be unconstitutional in Germany and therefore illegal in Europe, is the promise that there will be no haircut of any piece of paper that the ECB has bought from member states. If I were to haircut those 27 billions, the whole legal framework of QE is put in jeopardy. Tomorrow morning, Italy will be bankrupt. So that was a credible threat. That was a much better credible threat because I would do it if I was allowed.
I'm going to say one more thing. Ladies and gentlemen, that is all we have time for. If you could all join me in saying thank you and goodbye to Yanis Varoufakis. Thank you so much from all of us.